Our story, a truly bewildering one, begins not in the UK, but across the water in Ireland. Here lived Sabina and Ursula Eriksson, identical twins originally from Sweden. They seemed to lead perfectly ordinary lives. Sabina was in a relationship and had 2 children. Ursula resided in the United States. There was nothing on the surface to suggest the strangeness that was about to unfold. Nothing to hint at the darkness that would soon descend upon them, and by extension upon several unsuspecting strangers. Their lives were, by all accounts, unremarkable, which makes what happened next all the more difficult to comprehend. It was a classic case of the calm before a storm nobody saw coming. In May 2008, the twins decided to travel together. Ursula flew from America to join Sabina in Ireland. Their plan, it seemed, was to take a short trip to London. They boarded a ferry from Ireland to Liverpool, a routine journey made by thousands of people every year. But for the Erikssons, this trip was different. It was the start of a descent into a shared reality that no one else could penetrate. On the ferry, their behavior started to become noticeably odd. They were acting strangely, though the details of this initial phase remained somewhat sparse. It was on a National Express coach from Liverpool heading towards London that their conduct escalated from merely peculiar to genuinely alarming. The coach driver grew increasingly concerned. The twins were clutching their bags tightly, refusing to let them be stowed in the luggage compartment. They complained of feeling unwell. Their behavior was so disruptive and erratic that the driver, feeling he had no other choice, asked them to leave the coach at a service station near Stoke-on-Trent. This was not a simple case of unruly passengers, it was something else entirely. It was as if they were operating under a set of rules that only they understood, guided by a fear or a belief that was invisible to everyone else around them. The driver reported them to the service station manager, noting they seemed to be in a state of distress. Left at the service station, their agitation didn't subside, it intensified. They began walking, not towards the nearest town, but towards the M6 motorway, one of Britain's busiest and most dangerous roads. It's a place of constant motion, of roaring engines and fast-moving steel. For 2 women on foot, it was an incredibly perilous environment. Their decision to walk along the central reservation was not just strange, it was suicidal. This was the moment their private crisis spilled out into the public domain, captured on camera for a television show, turning a personal tragedy into a national spectacle. The stage was set for an incident that would baffle police, doctors, and the public for years to come. The scene on the M6 was one of organized chaos, the kind you see every day on a major motorway. Cars and lorries thundered past at 70 miles per hour. Into this relentless river of traffic walked Sabina and Ursula. A film crew for the BBC series Motorway Cops happened to be on the scene filming with the Central Motorway Police Group. What they captured was beyond anything they could have anticipated. The footage shows the twins eerily calm at first, walking down the narrow central reservation. They seemed oblivious to the immense danger they were in, as if protected by an invisible shield. Police officers arrived, trying to coax them to safety, but the twins were not listening to reason. Suddenly, without any warning, Ursula broke away. She ran directly into the side of a fast-moving, articulated lorry. The impact was sickening. It threw her into the air, her body landing in a crumpled heap on the tarmac. Her legs were crushed. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. Her twin sister, Sabina, watched this happen. And then, moments later, she did the exact same thing. She ran headlong into the path of a red Volkswagen Polo. The car struck her with incredible force, knocking her unconscious for a full 15 minutes. The windscreen was shattered. The scene was one of carnage and utter confusion. The paramedics and police who attended the scene were astounded. Ursula, despite her horrific injuries, was conscious and fighting them off. She was screaming, spitting and scratching at the very people who were trying to save her life. It took several officers to restrain her. Sabina, after lying motionless on the road, suddenly regained consciousness. She leapt to her feet, shouting, "They're going to steal your organs." It was a bizarre, paranoid declaration. She then punched a police officer in the face before running across the motorway again, trying to get to the other side, still seemingly intent on causing herself more harm. The officers eventually managed to subdue both women. They were in a state that defied simple explanation. They were injured, clearly, but their strength and aggression were phenomenal. Ursula was airlifted to hospital with 2 broken legs. Sabina was also taken for medical treatment, though her injuries appeared less severe, which in itself was a miracle. The police were left scratching their heads. They had just witnessed 2 people deliberately try to kill themselves in the most public and violent way imaginable, and then fight off their rescuers with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. The question on everyone's mind was simple: why? With the immediate crisis on the motorway over, the investigation into the twins' behavior began. What could possibly lead 2 seemingly normal women to act in such a self-destructive and violent manner? The first and most obvious theory was drug use. The police suspected that a substance like PCP or another powerful hallucinogen might be responsible for their extreme paranoia, agitation, and incredible strength. It would explain their detachment from reality and their resistance to pain. However, when the toxicology reports came back, they were clean. There were no illegal drugs and only a small therapeutic amount of an antidepressant in their systems. The drug theory, the simplest explanation, was off the table. This led investigators down a more complex path: mental health. The way the twins mirrored each other's actions pointed towards a rare psychiatric condition known as folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder. This is a phenomenon where a delusion is transmitted from one individual to another. Typically, there is a dominant person, the primary, who first develops a psychotic illness. They then impose their delusional beliefs onto a more suggestible secondary person. Given their close bond as identical twins, it seemed plausible that one sister had developed a paranoid delusion and the other had become swept up in it, creating a closed, impenetrable reality for them both. Another possibility explored was an underlying neurological condition. Some experts wondered if a brain tumor or a rare form of epilepsy could trigger such extreme and bizarre behavior. Certain medical conditions can manifest as acute psychosis, causing hallucinations, paranoia, and erratic actions. Without a full neurological workup, it was hard to rule this out completely. The twins' behavior was so extreme that it felt like something more than a purely psychological breakdown. It was as though their brains' wiring had been fundamentally short-circuited, leading them to perceive a world of threats where none existed. The lack of a clear answer only deepened the mystery. Ultimately, the most compelling theory remained shared psychosis. The twins were reported to be speaking about their family in Sweden being in danger and that they were being pursued. This paranoid belief system would explain their flight, their fear of the authorities, and their desperate self-destructive acts on the motorway. They weren't trying to commit suicide in the conventional sense. They were trying to escape something they believed was far worse. They perceived the police and paramedics not as helpers, but as agents of the very people they were fleeing from. Their shared delusion had become their reality, and on the M6, that reality had collided violently with the real world. Following the terrifying incident on the M6, Sabina was taken to University Hospital of North Staffordshire. Considering she had been hit by a car at high speed, her recovery was astonishing. She was treated for minor injuries and kept for observation. She appeared calm, even chatty with the hospital staff and police officers. She seemed to have returned to some semblance of normality. Her behavior was so convincing that after just 5 hours in police custody at the hospital, she was deemed fit for release. The authorities concluded that she was no longer a danger to herself or others. This would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. On the evening of May 19, 2008, just a day after the motorway incident, Sabina was discharged. She walked out of the hospital and into the nearby town of Stoke-on-Trent. She had no phone, no money, and nowhere to go. Her sister Ursula was still hospitalized with severe injuries, so Sabina was now alone, adrift in an unfamiliar town. Her calm demeanor had been a fragile mask, hiding the turmoil that was still raging within her. The shared delusion hadn't vanished. It had simply lost one of its participants for the time being. Sabina was now a vessel of that paranoia, wandering the streets, her mind still a battleground of unseen fears. Her behavior quickly became erratic again. She was seen approaching strangers, asking for directions to a bed and breakfast or a hotel. She was carrying her few possessions in a clear plastic bag given to her by the hospital. She seemed lost and vulnerable. She was also reportedly stroking a dog she met on the street, then acting strangely towards its owner. The paranoia that had driven her onto the motorway was bubbling back to the surface. She was a ticking time bomb, and the clock was counting down with every step she took through the quiet residential streets of Fenton, a suburb of Stoke-on-Trent. It was during this wandering that she encountered two local men, Glenn Hollinshead and his friend, Peter Malloy. They were walking Glenn's dog. Seeing this distressed woman, they did what many of us hope we would do in a similar situation. They offered help. Glenn, a 54-year-old self-employed welder and former RAF paramedic, was known for his kindness and generosity. He took pity on Sabina. He couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. He invited her back to his home on Duke Street, offering her a safe place to rest and figure out her next steps. It was an act of pure compassion, a simple gesture of human decency that would have devastating consequences. Back at Glenn Hollinshead's house, the evening started calmly enough. Glenn, Peter, and Sabina sat and talked. Glenn was trying to help her find a place to stay for the night, making phone calls to local bed and breakfasts. Sabina's behavior, however, was becoming increasingly strange. She seemed twitchy and paranoid. She kept getting up to look out of the window as if expecting someone to arrive. She offered the men cigarettes, only to snatch them out of their mouths before they could be lit, claiming they were poisoned. This was a clear sign that her delusional state was taking hold once more. The invisible pursuers from her paranoid reality were closing in. Glenn, despite her odd behavior, remained patient and kind. He was a good-natured man, trying to make sense of a confusing situation. He likely attributed her actions to the trauma she had just experienced, or perhaps intoxication, not realizing he was in the presence of someone in the grip of a severe psychotic episode. Peter Malloy, feeling increasingly uneasy about the situation, decided to leave. He urged Glenn to be careful, but Glenn, ever the good Samaritan, was determined to help this troubled woman. He was left alone with Sabina, a decision that sealed his fate. The atmosphere in the small house must have been thick with tension and unspoken fear. The next morning, the fragile peace was shattered. Glenn went to the kitchen to make them both a drink. It was then that Sabina, in a sudden, inexplicable act of violence, picked up a kitchen knife. She stabbed Glenn Hollinshead 5 times. It was a brutal and senseless attack on the very person who had shown her nothing but kindness. Glenn, mortally wounded, staggered out of his house, clutching his chest. He managed to tell a neighbor, "She stabbed me," before collapsing. He died from his injuries before the ambulance could arrive. His act of compassion had cost him his life. After the attack, Sabina fled the house, grabbing a small hammer from Glenn's toolbox as she went. Her psychosis was now in full flight. She ran through the streets, pursued by the neighbors who had been alerted by the commotion. At one point, she began hitting herself on the head with the hammer, seemingly in a frenzy of self-harm. The chase came to a dramatic end when she jumped from a 40-foot-high bridge onto the A50, a busy dual carriageway below. Incredibly, she survived the fall, sustaining a fractured skull and broken ankle. Police and paramedics arrived to find a scene of chaos for the second time in as many days, with Sabina at its epicenter. Lying injured on the A50 road, Sabina was once again in the hands of the emergency services. She was taken to the same hospital where she had been treated just a day earlier. The cycle of bizarre events had come full circle, but this time it had left a tragic and irreversible outcome. A kind man was dead, and Sabina was now not just a patient but a murder suspect. While recovering from her injuries in the hospital, she was placed under arrest for the murder of Glenn Hollinshead. The police were faced with the daunting task of trying to understand the motive behind such a violent and seemingly random act. During her interviews with the police, Sabina's state of mind remained a puzzle. At times she was lucid and cooperative, but at others she was withdrawn and silent. When questioned about Glenn Hollinshead, she gave a chillingly simple reply: "I killed him." She offered no real explanation, no justification, no story of a struggle or a perceived threat from him. It was a flat admission of guilt, devoid of the context or emotion one might expect. She did, however, consent to providing a DNA sample and confirmed the knife found at the scene was the weapon she had used. Her confession was as baffling as her crimes. The legal process began, but it was clear from the outset that this was no ordinary case. Sabina was initially charged with murder. However, as psychiatrists began to evaluate her, a picture of profound mental illness started to emerge. Her legal team prepared a defense based on her mental state at the time of the killing. They argued that she was not fully in control of her actions, that her perception of reality was so distorted by her psychosis that she could not be held fully responsible for what she had done. The prosecution had to consider this powerful psychiatric evidence. Ultimately, the Crown Prosecution Service accepted a plea of guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. This legal concept acknowledges that a defendant's mental abnormality, while not sufficient to constitute legal insanity, substantially impaired their ability to understand their conduct or exercise self-control. It was a recognition by the court that Sabina Eriksson was not a cold, calculated killer, but a deeply unwell woman whose illness had led to a terrible tragedy. Her sentencing would reflect this complex and heartbreaking reality, leaving many to question if justice could ever truly be served in such a case. The trial of Sabina Eriksson took place in September 2009. The courtroom was tasked with navigating the murky waters where criminal law and severe mental illness intersect. The charge was manslaughter, not murder, a crucial distinction that shaped the entire proceedings. The prosecution's acceptance of this lesser charge was based on overwhelming psychiatric reports. These reports detailed Sabina's condition, diagnosing her with a form of delusional disorder, likely the rare folie à deux shared with her sister. The court heard how this condition had warped her sense of reality, leading her to believe she was in danger. During the sentencing, the judge, Mr. Justice Saunders, acknowledged the profound complexity of the case. He stated that Sabina was a secondary sufferer of the shared psychotic disorder, with her sister Ursula being the primary source. He concluded that Sabina's responsibility for her actions was significantly diminished. He described the killing of Glenn Hollinshead as a tragic event, emphasizing that Glenn had done nothing wrong and had only tried to help. The judge also had to balance the need for public protection against the reality of Sabina's illness. He had to decide on a sentence that was both just to the victim and appropriate for the defendant's condition. The sentence handed down was 5 years in prison. To many observers, this seemed shockingly lenient for the taking of a human life. Glenn Hollinshead's family, in particular, felt that justice had not been done. His brother, Gary, expressed his belief that Sabina had manipulated the system, feigning madness to escape a murder conviction. He argued that the authorities had failed his brother twice, first by releasing Sabina from the hospital, and second by giving her what he considered to be a light sentence. The public outcry was considerable, with many people struggling to understand how such a violent act could result in such a short prison term. The judge's decision, however, was bound by the law and the psychiatric evidence presented. He explained that Sabina's mental illness was the key factor. "I have to sentence you on the basis that your responsibility for what you did is low," he told her. He believed that she would not have committed the crime had she not been ill. The sentence was intended to ensure she received treatment and was monitored with the expectation that she would be eligible for release after serving half her term. The case highlighted a fundamental tension in the justice system: how to punish a crime when the perpetrator's mind is not their own. It left a lingering sense of unease and a debate that continues to this day. To truly grasp the Eriksson twins case, we must delve deeper into the strange world of folie à deux. The term is French for a madness for two, and it describes a rare psychiatric syndrome where a delusion is passed from one person to another. It's like a contagious belief. One person, the primary, develops a psychosis with specific, often paranoid delusions. They might believe they are being followed, that their food is poisoned, or that they are the target of a vast conspiracy. This person is typically more dominant, intelligent, and forceful in the relationship. They are the architect of the shared false reality. This secondary individual is usually more passive, suggestible, and dependent on the primary. Through close association, often in an isolated environment, they gradually come to accept the primary's delusions as their own reality. This is not a simple case of one person lying and the other believing them. The secondary's belief is genuine and deeply held. In the case of the Eriksson twins, their bond as identical twins likely made them particularly susceptible. They had a lifetime of shared experiences and a deep intrinsic connection, creating the perfect fertile ground for such a delusion to take root and flourish, shutting out the objective world around them. In this specific case, it is believed that Ursula was the primary. She was the one who, according to reports, had been experiencing more personal difficulties leading up to the trip. It is theorized that she developed a paranoid delusion that they were being pursued by people who wanted to harm them or their family. Sabina, the secondary, became absorbed into this delusional world. Their bizarre actions on the coach and the motorway were not random acts of madness, but logical steps within their shared paranoid narrative. Running into traffic was not suicide. It was a desperate, irrational attempt to escape their phantom pursuers. This diagnosis helps to explain why Sabina's behavior could shift so rapidly. When she was with her sister, the delusion was reinforced. When she was alone in the hospital, she seemed to briefly return to reality, appearing calm and rational. But once released back into the world alone, the paranoid framework her sister had built for her came rushing back. She was still operating under its rules. Glenn Hollinshead wasn't seen as a kind stranger, but potentially as another agent of the conspiracy she was fleeing from. The tragedy of Folie à Deux is that it isolates its victims from reality, turning potential helpers into perceived threats, often with devastating consequences. Years after the events of May 2008, the story of the Eriksson twins continues to fascinate and disturb us. It remains one of the most bizarre cases in modern British criminal history. Part of its enduring power comes from the fact that it was caught on camera. We can watch the chaos unfold. On the M6, we can see the raw, unfiltered madness. This visual evidence makes it feel immediate and real, pulling it out of the realm of a simple crime report and turning it into a piece of real-life horror cinema. It forces us to be witnesses, and as witnesses, we are compelled to try and understand what we have seen. The case also serves as a stark and troubling lesson about mental illness. It shows how quickly a mind, or in this case, two minds, can unravel. It demonstrates that psychosis is not always a slow decline. It can be an acute, explosive event that erupts with terrifying force. The story forces us to confront the limitations of our understanding of the human brain. We are left with more questions than answers. Why did the delusion take this specific form? What was the initial trigger? And most hauntingly, could it happen to anyone? The randomness and the severity of the twins' breakdown taps into a primal fear of losing control of our own minds. Furthermore, the case raises difficult questions about the justice system and its handling of mentally ill offenders. The decision to release Sabina from the hospital so soon was, in hindsight, a fatal error. The subsequent 5-year sentence for manslaughter left many feeling that the system had failed to deliver justice for Glenn Hollinshead and his family. It highlights the profound challenge of balancing punishment, public safety, and compassionate treatment for those who commit terrible acts while not in their right mind. There are no easy answers here, only a painful conflict between our desire for retribution and our knowledge of human frailty. Ultimately, the Eriksson twins saga is a modern-day Gothic tale. It has all the elements of a great mystery: identical twins, a secret journey, inexplicable violence, and a descent into madness. It reminds us that the line between sanity and insanity can be terrifyingly thin, and that behind the veneer of ordinary life, extraordinary and terrifying things can be happening. It is a story about the fragility of the human mind, the tragic consequences of a system's failure, and the profound kindness of a man who paid the ultimate price for his compassion. It's a story that, once heard, is impossible to forget.